Well, good morning. Today, we finish up our series in John chapter 21. It's the series, The Way, the Truth, and the Life. And to be honest, as we finish our series today, I actually don't know of a better way to finish a book than how John finished John chapter 20. And in John 20, verse 31, this is what he writes. He writes, "But these were written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have power in his name. You will have life by the power of his name." Right, that's just clean, right? That's crisp. That's a good ending. That's a solid ending. But if we don't have chapter 21, we miss a key part of the narrative of the Bible. We actually miss what God is getting ready to do. Because John 21, it wraps up the book of John. It's like the epilogue. It's the ending. It's the final thoughts of John. But it's also the setup for the book of Acts. Right? And here in 21, we're going to get the end of kind of Peter's story in the middle of the life of Jesus. And as we get ready to go in, as if we were to continue on in the book of Acts, we would see Peter's name appear over 71 times in 15 chapters. Like Peter's a key piece to what's going on. But let's see kind of what's happening here, because right here at this moment in time, some people know that Jesus is alive. Some people know the message of Jesus, but he wants everybody to know the message about himself. And he's going to use Peter to do it. Now see, let's go back to the beginning of Peter's life. At the beginning of Peter's life, Jesus sees him and his brother Andrew fishing, and he says to Peter and Andrew, "Come and follow me. I'm going to make you fishers of men." And then they come and they follow him, and a little time later, in Matthew 16, Jesus says this to Peter. He says, "Now I say to you that you are Peter," which means rock. "And upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it." Right, this is what Jesus has for Peter. I mean, this is a big mission. This is a huge plan. This is a massive ask for a guy. So who is this Peter? Right, he must be somebody pretty special, right? Let's take a look at who Peter was. Well, first off, Peter was a fisherman. He was a fisherman by trade. He was an expert, right? A lot of people would have looked to him to figure out how to make it happen. Not only was Peter a fisherman, but he also walked on water. Right? So if you're going to be a fisherman, somebody fishing for men, and he walks on water, that's pretty cool. But then we go on to see some more about who is this Peter. Well, he has a conversation with Jesus, and when he's talking with Jesus, he rebukes him to his face. He tells him he's wrong to his face. And you know what Jesus says? He says, "Get behind me, Satan." But then he goes on from there. He says, okay, some time passes, and he says, "You know what, Jesus, I would die for you. Right? I'm sold out. I'm going to follow you." And then shortly after he says that, you know what happens? Jesus says, "Okay, I'm going to go pray. I want you to just stay awake right over here. I'm going to go pray so that you can kind of keep watch." You know what Peter does? He falls asleep 3 times on him. This guy who says, "I'm going to die for you," he can't even stay awake. And then shortly after that, Jesus gets arrested. And after he's arrested, then Peter sees this Roman guard, draws a sword, and cuts the guy's ears off to try to stop him from arresting Jesus. It wasn't just cutting his ear off, it's attempted murder. And then from there on, shortly after, the same night, Jesus is on trial, and he's sitting around a charcoal fire trying to stay warm, and 3 separate times, somebody asks him, "Wait a minute, aren't you one of his followers? Don't you know him?" And he denies him 3 times. This is the guy that you're going to use to spread the news and the message of Jesus. How could God use somebody like that? How could God use somebody like that? I mean, it's crazy. Surely there's got to be somebody better. Have you ever wondered that? Have you ever asked that question? How could God use somebody like that? Maybe it wasn't about Peter, but maybe it was somebody else. How could God use somebody like them? I know their story, I know their past, but you know what? That's kind of getting judgmental. So I want to avoid that. I want to actually turn the question and ask this. Have you ever asked that question in a mirror? Have you ever looked yourself in the mirror and wondered, God, how can you use somebody like me? God, I know you have the power to change other people's lives. You have the power, but me? No. God, I'm too old. God, I'm too young. I lost it on my kids the other day. God, I promised that the thing that I wouldn't continue to run back to, I did it again. God, I relapsed last week. God, I'm poor. God, I'm on my second marriage, and it's probably about to fail. God, how could you use somebody like me? I don't see it. But here in John 21, it's hard to imagine that Peter was thinking something else other than this. God, how could you use somebody like me? And without John 21, we miss a pivotal part of Peter's story. We see here, we're going to see Peter get a second chance. And it's not really just a second chance. It's probably more like a fourth or a fifth or a sixth or a seventh chance. And this is Jesus stepping into Peter's story to say, hey, I've got a mission for you. I've got a mission, and I'm going to use you to do it. I'm not using it because of you. I see your resume. I'll consider your resume, but I'm not going to use it against you. And I'm not going to let that be a reason to pull you out of my mission and my plan for you and for the world. And so here in this mission, we're going to take a little look at how could God use somebody like this. We're going to see how God could use somebody like this, and not just somebody like this, but somebody like us. How can God use us? And how does God want to use us? He's got this mission, and in this mission, we're going to see three separate ways, and it's not what I say. This is what John wrote. We're going to see three parts of the mission, right? There's fishing, there's forgiveness, and then there's feeding. And we're going to see what those things mean. Those are kind of weird words, and so we're going to unpack those just a little bit. So the first part of this mission that Jesus invites Peter onto is to be a fisher of men. It involves fishing. Now, in the church, we would call this evangelism, which means sharing the hope of Jesus. It's leading people to Jesus. And here at WCC, more specifically, we say it this way. We want to share the hope of the gospel. And if you spend any time here, you're going to hear us say, we're called to share the hope of the gospel. And the hope of the gospel is the good news that Jesus saves. It's fishing for men. It's fishing for people. And in the baptism, right, we say we identify with him in his death and his resurrection. There's fish under the water that are dead, and we want to bring them out and bring them to Jesus. There's people who are spiritually dead, and we want to show them the author of life. It involves fishing. And in fishing, sometimes when you think about evangelism and sharing your faith, sometimes it feels like it's just kind of this separate thing that's reserved for missionaries and pastors and maybe professional Christians. But what we're about to see here is that this happens. Jesus has this conversation and he prepares his disciples for the mission in one of the most ordinary ways, on one of the most simple days. There's nothing special about this day, and Jesus uses this as a training ground for the mission. Let's pick up in verse 1. In verse 1, it says this: Later, Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. And this is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there: Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples. There's 7 guys on this boat. And Peter says, I'm going fishing. And we'll come too, they all said. So they went out to the boat, but they caught nothing all night. I want to stop here because these were expert fishermen, right? These guys knew what they were doing. Not only were they expert fishermen, but as an expert fisherman, as somebody who's been in the trade for a while, you knew that in order to make a living and to make money doing this, you had to go fishing at night. Because on the Sea of Galilee, at night, the fish would come to the surface, and that was the best time to catch the fish. So you catch the fish at night, and by the time the dawn comes, you clean up everything that you've caught so that you could take it to the market. And when you take it to the market, you've got the best place on the block. It's like, man, I'm going to buy fish from these guys. They've got the good stuff. They got the fresh. And these guys are, it's like saying, hey, show me the money, right? I know what I'm doing here, right? I'm taking this and I'm bringing this to you. This is the good stuff. So for these guys to be out on the boat, on the lake all night and not catch a single thing, that's a big deal, because what would begin to happen over time is people would lose trust in those fishermen. I got to find my food somewhere else. And not only that, not only did they not catch anything for the market, they didn't even catch anything for themselves, because after you'd make a big catch, you'd hold a couple back. You had a long night's work. Man, you got to kind of replenish, right? You got to eat. This is a big deal. But Jesus uses this. He uses this to prepare them for the mission. He has a mission, and he's going to use this unfortunate circumstance to prepare them to go out and to fish for men. And when Jesus shows up on this unfortunate evening, this ordinary evening, this simple night, God doesn't ask them to stop their work to join the mission. He doesn't say, hey, drop the nets, come and follow me, I'll feed you, I'll take care of you. I've fed 5,000, I've fed 15,000, I've fed a multitude. Come follow me, I'll get you some food. He doesn't ask them to stop their work. He shows up, and instead he asks for their obedience. Let's see what he says here. See, at dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, and the disciples, they couldn't see who he was. And he called out, fellows, have you caught any fish? No, they replied. And then he said, throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll catch some. So they did it. And they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. In fact, later on, we see that there was 153 fish. Now the focus isn't so much on the number of the fish, but it's the miraculous catch. You mean to tell me these 7 professionals couldn't catch a single fish after an 8-hour shift? And Jesus says, go to the other side of the boat and drop your nets, and they can't even pull the net in. What is Jesus showing these people? He's preparing them for the mission. And the mission that they're about to go on is too big for themselves. Right? He's using an actual scenario to say, hey, this thing that I'm calling you to, this thing that, by the way, I haven't stopped calling you to it because of your past, because of your mistakes, because of your history. I'm calling you in, and it's going to be bigger than yourselves, but here's what I'm asking you to do. In the midst of your ordinary life, in the midst of the everyday, the day-to-day grind, are you willing to obey? Are you willing to follow my lead? I mean, think about it. For 8 hours, you mean to tell me they didn't try once flipping their net to the other side of the boat? They probably had guys on both sides of the boat. Jesus is showing them here, trust me, follow my lead. I'm going to make it happen. I want you to fish for men. I'm going to provide the opportunities. I'm going to provide the people. But are you willing to step out in faith? Are you willing to listen? And not just listen, are you willing to share? Are you willing to go that distance? See, part of fishing for people involves showing the love of Jesus and sharing the love of Jesus. It's not just showing it, and it's not just sharing it. It involves both. On this mission, right, think about this. If you only show the love of Jesus, right, you're a good person, right, you live a good life, you don't cuss, you don't drink, you don't, play cards and gamble, whatever they used to, I don't know, whatever used to say a long time ago is, I don't do those things. But you never share the hope of Jesus, then whose life are you elevating? Is it yours or is it his? Is it his life in yours? Or is it just you're living a good life and you're a good person? But on the flip side of that, if you only ever tell about the good news of Jesus and the hope that we have in him, but you never show it, that's what the world would call a hypocrite. And that's one of the biggest things that turn people away from following Jesus. I don't want to follow somebody who's just, they talk a big game, but they never show it in their actions. How do we fish for people? It's showing and telling. Because when you show it, when you live it out, what you're showing to the world is that there's a power out there that has the ability to change the way that you live. And then when they notice that and recognize it, then you give God the credit, because we know any good and perfect gift comes from God. So anything good about my life is him. It's Jesus. It's Jesus. I'm not perfect, but he's working on me, right? It's a work in progress. I think about, I've shared part of my story before. When I had a scholarship to play baseball at a high school, and so I go to college, and I was so focused on keeping that scholarship that I only focused on baseball, and I was awarded with a year off of school. Got a letter that said, hey, we're going to ask you to not come back, right? So in that time off, I went to school to play baseball and study ministry, to be a pastor. I wanted to wait to be in the position of a pastor. But in that year off, what I learned was, if I wait to be in a position to share my faith, in a position to live out my faith, then I'm waiting for a position to change me, and I don't really have the posture, the heart posture, to say, God, I want you to use me wherever I'm at. So I was working at Menards, right? It was morning stock. It was kind of like the lowest end of the totem pole, right? You get there at 5 o'clock, wake up at 3, work from 5 to 1, and then you go home, right? It was an early morning, right? 6 days a week. So I go in, and I'm like, okay, God, begin working on me, right? I'm not perfect, but let me live out my faith. Let me show it, right? Let me have a good work ethic. After a few months, this guy comes up and says, hey, I just noticed something. You don't join in on some of these jokes. You don't cuss. You don't go out drinking with us afterwards, and all this kind of stuff, and all this stuff. What's going on? What's different about your life? See, I was expecting that to happen after a week of following Jesus. This was a couple months of staying consistent, not perfect, but consistent. And that was the opportunity to say, I follow Jesus. And honestly, this is not me just trying to be a good person. This is me saying, I just want to follow him. And I think he has the ability to change your life too. It's showing and sharing. It's fishing for people. It's living out your faith and sharing your faith. It's both and. It's fishing for people. When we go on from here and we see the next part of the mission come up, and we see here that Peter was an expert fisherman, and he said, the mission is still the same. I want you to fish for men. But here, we're going to go to the next part of the story. We see forgiveness, because forgiveness is the central part to this mission. It's the forgiveness of God through the person and the work of Jesus Christ. That's what he's offered us, and that's what he's invited us into. But here in Peter's story, where we left off with Peter is this. Yeah, he was on a boat fishing at night, but right before that, the last thing we read about him is that he left the tomb and he went home. It doesn't say that he believed. He's still wrestling with his sin. He's still wrestling with all the ways he's let Jesus down. But here is Peter's second chance. This is where Jesus interacts and intersects Peter's story. And in verse 9, so from verse 6 to verse 9, they recognize that it's Jesus, and then Peter jumps into the water, swims to the shore where Jesus is. And this is where it picks up. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fishing cooking over a charcoal fire, and some bread. Bring some of the fish that you just caught, Jesus said. So they gather the fish and they bring it back, and now come and have some breakfast, Jesus said. None of the disciples, they didn't dare ask him who he was, for they knew that it was the Lord. This is the continuation of the preparation of the mission. See, Jesus was going to send them out. They're going to be participants of it, but he wants Peter to be a recipient of this forgiveness. You're going to go preach forgiveness. You're going to preach the good news, but Peter, I want you to have the personal experience with the forgiveness that I have to offer. And you say, where do we see this here? Well, at that time, in that culture, if you wronged somebody, you could offer forgiveness. And one of the best ways to do that was with a meal, around the table, eating food. All right, in that time, they called it fellowship. But here, around the table, eating food was the opportunity to offer somebody forgiveness. And it's not just forgiveness. This is, the setting is all, it speaks to Peter's downfall. Because here's the thing, the word fire only appears 3 times in John's gospel. Right, once in Jesus' teaching early on, but then the other 2 times that the charcoal fire, specifically the charcoal fire appears, is when Peter denies Jesus. It says he was waiting outside where Jesus was on trial. He was waiting around a fire. It was a charcoal fire. And he was sitting there, and that's where he denied Jesus 3 times. So for Jesus to have the charcoal fire, yes, it's cooking fish, but it's in the context of forgiveness. In other words, what Jesus is saying here is that I don't want you going forward from here every time you see a fire to be reminded of your sin. I want you to be reminded of my forgiveness. I want to redeem this moment in your life. So every time you see a fire, you remember this, not that. See, the forgiveness that Jesus has to offer, it can literally change your life. And it has the ability and the power to change your thinking, to change the way that you live. And it has the power to redeem your past and repurpose it for your future. That's what Jesus has to offer. And he's saying, here, come have a meal with me. And what's interesting is he has fish already cooking over the fire, but then he says, go and bring the fish that you just caught. Jesus is saying, I'm going to use the abilities that I've given you. The things that I put in you, I'm going to use it. The things that you thought, what was the point of that part of my life? God, how could you redeem something like that? God, how could you reuse something like that for your good and for your glory? And Jesus is saying, hey, I'm going to use you and your abilities and your gifts. Just bring them. Are you willing to bring it to the table? That is what Jesus can do. But are you willing to obey him and say, God, I'm bringing this? And what's so fascinating about this part of the story is Jesus, who just caught some fish, he created those fish. Right? He created those things. He could have brought way more to the fire. He knew those guys were out there. He could have gone and caught 7 more fish to feed those guys. But what he's doing is he's preparing them. You're going to continue to work. And as you work, I'm going to use you not because of you, but I'm going to use you because of what I've put in you. And think about this, and more practically speaking, like we think about this in our context today. I was thinking about this. Here at WCC, we've sent out some missionaries over the past few years. I was thinking about Dan and Madison Murphy. Dan and Madison Murphy were engineers by trade. And what does an engineer do? They design, they create, and they build, right? They design, they create, and they build. You say, well, how could God use something like that, that gift set, that skill set to be a missionary, to take the gospel to a least reach people group, somebody who doesn't have the hope of the gospel? How could you use that? Well, in their training, what they're doing is they're being prepared, they're being equipped to design a written language for a people group that doesn't have one, to take that written language and to put the Bible into that, to create the Bible in that written language, and then to build a church in that people group. See, before they were working for the orthopedic industry. They were making things to make the body better. But God's saying, I'm going to take those things and I'm going to repurpose that, and I'm going to use it to go plant a church, to take the hope of the gospel to these people. And that's just an engineer, but think about you and your job. The things that you do, the things that God has put in you. What are some of those things he might want to repurpose to spread the hope of the gospel here in Warsaw and in Kosciuszko County. He may not be calling you to go across seas, go overseas to a jungle, to a place that doesn't have a church. He may be calling you to step in to serve right here. You may be wondering, God, how could you use somebody like me? He might want to take some of those very things, repurpose it, and speak into somebody else's life. Jesus is here on the beach and he's having a meal, and when the meal gets over, he moves to the final part of the mission. See, he's prepared them. He said, I want you to fish for men, and I want you to remember the forgiveness that I have to offer, but I also want you to feed my sheep. It involves feeding. And this is probably the most famous part of the passage, right? Where Jesus and Peter, after the meal, they're talking, and Jesus asks Peter 3 times, Peter, do you love me? Peter says yes. Then feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Yes. Then take care of my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Yes. Then feed my sheep. And Peter was hurt by this. Peter was hurt by this. God, I thought you just forgave me. I thought this was over. I thought we've moved on. What's going on here? And Jesus is saying, hey, yes, fishing and forgiveness, but also it's feeding. It's not just bringing people to Jesus. It's growing their relationship with me. There's this whole new life that I want them to live, and I want to invite them to be part of. And it involves feeding, and that's kind of a weird word, of feeding. What does it mean to feed the sheep? It's digging in to the Word of God. It's pursuing Jesus on our own and together. It's by myself. It's this personal relationship with Jesus, and it's personal, but it's never meant to be private. We are part of the community of faith. It's growing in our relationship together. And here at WCC, we say it this way. It's growing deeper in our relationship with Christ and sharing the hope of the gospel. That's our mission. That's what we're about. You say, what does it mean? Right? Do I have to wait till I'm like a mature Christian? Do I have to wait till I've arrived? Do I have to wait till I'm a certain age? And no, it's saying, okay, no matter what stage of life, no matter what stage of faith, no matter how long you've been following Jesus, whether it's been a week or 10 years or 80 years, I'm going to pursue Jesus with others. You know, as we finish up and as we wrap up, I was thinking about this in my life. What does it mean to feed? And as I transition into a new role here at WCC, my wife and I, we were talking about this, thinking back on the 10 years I spent in student ministry, and just, you know, the different stories. Sometimes when you think on stories and students, you laugh, right? There's some funny things that happen, and you remember those, but there's also some things, people you remember, you're like, man, we walked through some hard stuff. There was this kid that his parents were getting ready to go through a divorce. And it was really hard on him. And so we said, okay, why don't I just meet with you and we go over God's word, right? It actually started as a college assignment. When I was I was finishing up at Grace College, and one of the assignments was meet with somebody for 8 weeks and read the word of God. So I said, okay, I got to do this for an assignment. And what started out as an assignment, an 8-week assignment, turned into a 3-year relationship. To say, hey, I don't have it all together, but let's do this. Let's just pursue Jesus together. And what happened over the course of those 3 years, as those 3 years were coming to an end, he started praying. And he knew I was getting ready to move. And he ended up, he started praying. He's like, this has been so impactful in my life. Here's what I want to do. I want to pray to do this with somebody else. And as we were praying about it, there was another kid who was his exact same age. As the time that his parents went through a divorce, his parents were getting ready to go through a divorce too. And he said, I think God's asking me to feed on God's word with this guy. That was in 2017. This last summer, Carissa and I, we went to B-Dubs on a date. As we're finishing up, getting ready to pay, we see this kid. And the kid he started discipling, feeding, 8 years ago, walk in to hang out and to connect and to catch up. And what's so cool about that is a picture what Jesus is inviting us into. I didn't have it all together. I wasn't perfect, right? I wasn't even finished with college. I was a college flunk out. I was a college dropout, but yet God offered the opportunity, and I just said, God, I'm willing. And for you and for me, it's saying, God, I'm willing to be part of the mission. I'm willing to be part of the mission. God, I don't have to have it all together. I don't have to be perfect. But God, make me a fisher of men. Let me share my hope, the hope that I have in Jesus, to remember forgiveness and to grow in our relationship with you. Don't let me do that alone. So as we finish this and we wrap up the series, I want us to think about this. Is Christ? The whole point of this series was to focus on the person of Jesus. And as the band leads us in this final song, I want to ask the question, is Jesus the focus of your life? Because that's where the true life transformation comes. Is Christ exalted in your life? Is he the main character of your story? So as we sing this, I want to invite you to consider that and to worship and to think about Jesus, to think about your life and to think about the mission he's inviting you and I into.